Chapter 1, Part 2 will look at how the behaviors we discussed in Part 1 that have been learned through pressure from the natural environment contribute to learning. I call this the building blocks of learning. To start, the first type of behavior we want to look at are reflexes. I'm sure you're familiar with reflexes. These are things like the doctor hitting your knee with a hammer and your leg popping out. Reflexes actually refer to the specific relationship between an event, the doctor hitting your knee with a hammer, and a response, you kicking. So the reflex isn't just that behavior, but rather the relationship between those two events. Another example, blinking when a speck of dirt hits your eye. That's a reflex that almost everybody, unless there's something going on neurologically, has. Reflexes are actually present at birth or appear at predictable stages shortly after birth. One example, pupil dilation, sneezing, vomiting. These are all reflexes that we're born with. Interestingly enough, we know that reflexes in some part disappear after the first few months of life. If you watch the video on the next slide, it will outline some of those for you. However, we know that reflexes don't always work. For example, when you consume excessive amounts of alcohol or drugs, this can actually depress the nervous system and cause you to not experience reflexes. Another example of where reflexes can potentially go wrong, not all reflexes are useful. Having an allergic reaction is actually a reflex that your body engages in when it is exposed to something that it doesn't like. Seizures that happen as an outcome of flickering lights are another example of a reflex that is kind of performing in a way that it should not be. However, reflexes do contribute to our survival. They are also consistent in form, frequency, and strength. And this is really key. Consistency in form means that that reflex always looks the same. Consistency in frequency, it always happens at the same rate. And then consistency in strength, it's always the same kind of intensity. You can't halfway blink, and you can't only blink some of the time when something comes into your eye. You are always going to engage in the same behavior at the same frequency and the same strength when that the environmental stimulus has occurred. The key here is that these reflexes will eventually become behaviors that we can engage in on purpose. Eventually, we learn to perform reflexive behaviors on purpose. As I mentioned, you can watch this video to kind of learn about a lot of the reflexes we have at birth. While many of these reflexes are things that disappear as we develop throughout the first year of life, many of them do not. The first thing I want you to know about that, the reflexes that disappear after the first few months of life disappear because we don't need them anymore. We've learned to survive in our environment without them. Alternatively, some of the reflexes, for example, the suckling and rooting reflex, meaning that if someone strokes the cheek of a baby, they will turn their mouth towards whatever that source was, that's rooting, and then they'll begin to suck. This reflex, again, a reflex, automatic behavior that we are born with, allows a baby to eat. Over time, they don't need that rooting and sucking reflex anymore because they've learned to do it themselves at the appropriate time to eat. We will talk a lot about how that learning occurs when we cover classical and operant conditioning. The next type of behavior I want you to be familiar with are modal action patterns. Colloquially, we call these instincts. These are going to be things like birds migrating south for the winter, mating behaviors, finding food, an animal finding food, hunting, dealing with threats for safety, and so on and so forth. Similarly to reflexes, modal action patterns have a strong genetic base. We are born with these behaviors already able to be performed or kind of coded into our brains. They are also elicited by an event, which we call a releaser. The weather gets cold, birds migrate south. The animal gets hungry, they find food. You might have just jumped when that appeared on your screen. That jumping is a modal action pattern. It's a response to the elicitor of this creepy bug. And just like with reflexes, serves an important protective ability for you. It protects you from something that might be a threat, or the bug. Unlike reflexes, modal action patterns involve your entire body or the entire organism. Jumping when you see a scary bug doesn't just involve your eye or your knee, or sneezing involving your nose. Those are reflexes. Modal action patterns involve your entire body. It takes a lot for you to jump back and recoil from the screen. You might have not been scared by the bug. Bugs creep me out, so they cause this modal action pattern, for me at least. So because of that, we say that modal action patterns are more complex behaviors. They are also more variable, meaning that they're not as consistent. Some of you might have only slightly recoiled when you saw the bug on the screen, but had you been in a more sensitive mindset, you might have jumped back completely. They're not as consistent. We can kind of vary in how intensely we perform modal action patterns. But just like reflexes, these behaviors contribute to the survival of the species and serve a protective purpose. For example, most people are afraid of rattlesnakes. Seeing a rattlesnake might have that same response as seeing that scary insect on the previous slide did. Having that response, that modal action pattern in response to seeing a snake, protects you from seeing that snake. Seasonal change can also cause modal action patterns. For example, hibernation, just like migrating south for the winter, can cause that behavior to be elicited, which is not something we see with reflexes. Mating and reproduction, again, another example of a modal action pattern. Again, just like with reflexes, over time, even though we're born with the ability to engage in these behaviors, we learn to control them ourselves through interaction with the environment. The last type of behavior I want to talk about is a general behavioral trait. And these are going to be the things that make up your personality, our tendency to engage in a certain kind of behavior, or our predisposition to behaving a certain way, being shy or outgoing, being aggressive versus being mild-mannered. These are all general behavior traits or characteristics that we're born with. Unlike modal action patterns, general behavioral traits actually occur in a wide variety of situations. You might be shy at home, you might be shy out in public, you might be shy at work, and so on and so forth. It's not just a response to a single stimuli, but rather a characteristic way of being. General behavioral traits are also very variable or changeable. I don't always have to be shy. I can make myself not be shy in a certain situation. So there's a lot more variability here. However, just like our other two types of behaviors, genes play an important role. Our general behavioral traits are largely determined by our genetic makeup. Quick study tip for you. I'm going to give you a few of these throughout the first unit, and I also might point out some key things in the subsequent units if there's something I want you to pay special attention to. For this lecture, make sure you know the difference between a reflex, a modal action pattern, and a behavioral trait, a general behavioral trait. One thing I'm going to suggest that you do when you're studying is identify those concepts that you think you might easily confuse with one another, and focus on what characteristics they share, how they're similar, and how they're different from one another. If you need help doing that, feel free to email me or set up a Zoom meeting. I'd be happy to kind of walk you through some tips on how to focus in on that. One key element here, all of these behaviors are learned from the environment or biology. But how are they different? Make sure you're paying attention to that. So we have these three different types of behaviors, and one key thing they all have in common is that they all serve an adaptive purpose. Think back to part 1 of this lecture. That word adaptive means they help us survive. We do them for a reason. A lot of times that reason might not necessarily be present in our environment anymore, but a lot of the time they are. We blink to protect our eyes from being wounded. Adaptive behaviors can also be a response to a change in the environment. Something new happens. We engage in one of these three types of behaviors to help us cope with that change. But even though all of these behaviors help us understand how learning begins and stem from that concept of natural selection, it has its limits. There's a lot more we know about learning. Again, this is just the building block. We take it a lot further than that, and that's what we'll focus on throughout the rest of the semester. Before I get into that, I want to give you a few key kind of vocab terms that you're going to need to know. The first and most important one, we'll talk about this a lot more in Chapter 2, but what is learning? The definition I want to start out with, a change in behavior due to experience or a change in the environment. That word change is key. Learning is changing because of something that's happened. It's not always adding something, however. Although a lot of the time when we talk about learning, we talk about acquisition or adding something. I learned a new fact. I learned how to perform this dance. Sometimes learning can involve just a simple change in behavior. I'm not getting better at something, I'm learning to do something else. A behavior is a thing that a person or animal does that can be measured. That's really important here. This class, all of the information we're going to be learning is based off of research. And because of that, we are kind of limited to what we can do research on, which means we're limited to learning or studying things that we can measure. So when we're talking about a behavior, that behavior has to be something that we can measure. We'll talk in Chapter 2 about how exactly we go about measuring these behaviors. I do want to point out that a behavior does not just have to be something physical. Behaviors can be thoughts and emotions as well, because we have tools as scientists that help us measure those. We also want to talk about what that term experience means, okay? Experience is just a change in the environment. I have an experience when I go to back out my car and there's something blocking it and I have to kind of maneuver around it in a way I've never done before. That's an experience. It teaches me something. It gives me the opportunity to learn. So any change in the environment, anything that's new, can be a learning experience. The word stimuli, you're going to hear me use that word a lot. Stimuli is any event that happens. Anything that happens in the environment that our bodies can sense that affect or are capable of affecting behavior. Something can happen in the environment, a stimuli can present itself that I can ignore, and it ends up not impacting my behavior. So a stimuli only has to have the ability, the capability of affecting behavior, but it can change the organism's environment or internal or physical sensations. Some stimuli could be hearing something, smelling something, seeing something, sensing something, tasting something. These are all examples of stimuli. Regardless, our focus and the focus of most research on learning looks specifically at readily observable behavior. So even though we have this more broad realm of things we can study as scientists, as learning behavioral psychologists, a lot of the research we have looks at behavior that is readily observable. So because of that, we're going to talk a lot about things like animal research, where we looked for specific broad observable behaviors that animals can engage in that we taught them to do, or that they learned from change in their environment. And I also want to quickly point out that when we're talking about change and stimuli and experiences and behaviors, these changes cannot involve drugs, injury, aging, or disease. Okay, that's not learning. That is change in behavior coming from a different source. Okay, so we are going to talk a lot about drugs later on in the class, but keep in mind, taking a drug and having that change your behavior is not considered learning. That's engaging in a behavior for some different reason. That brings me to the end of Chapter 1. Stay tuned for Chapter 2, when we'll be talking about how to research the field of learning.